In the 1960s, two of the most powerful men in the world were the President of the United States of America and the Prime Minister and Communist Party leader of the Soviet Union. In the autumn of 1962, they clashed over a Caribbean island near the United States and brought the world closer to nuclear war than at any time since 1945. The island was called Cuba. Until 1959, its capital, Havana, was the center of a military dictatorship under President Batista. He'd come to power in 1952. At first, he'd promised reform, but his government ruled by force and became corrupt. Cuba, known throughout the New World as the rich Americans' playground, was tailored to their needs and tastes. United States influence didn't end on the nightclub floor. It was the dominant fact of Cuban life. American investment was huge, giving them great influence and power. They owned the banks and many of the larger farms, too. Yet in the countryside, Cuba's peasants were without land, lacked machinery, and lived in poverty. The economy relied on sugar. Only if the crop was good and world sugar prices high could Cuba do relatively well. The biggest symbol of American influence was at Guantanamo Bay, a huge air and naval base leased for 99 years. By the late 1950s, Batista had become increasingly harsh. His opponents were dealt with ruthlessly. Then, in December 1956, a few anti-Batista revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro landed in Cuba. It was a disaster. Most were destroyed by Batista's forces, but a few managed to escape to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, remote, inaccessible, and safe. Here, Castro began to build a revolutionary base. He persuaded many villagers to support him and educated them in his political aims. His guerrillas improved their skills, and his support grew. By 1958, his hard core of only 300 men was enough to resist a major attempt by the Cuban army to destroy him. After this, Batista's defeat was only a matter of time. It came in January 1959. Castro's victory procession in Havana must have seemed like a fairy tale come true. Batista's army and government had been overthrown within 2 years. Castro was only 32. He seemed to sum up a new hope. One of his first steps was to punish those guilty of atrocities under Batista. It was obvious that the accused were going to be found guilty, and most of them probably were. Castro also looked forward to economic independence and demanded the end of foreign exploitation. Throughout the year, private companies, mainly foreign-owned, were taken over. As nationalization of these companies increased, so Americans were advised by their embassy to leave. Finally, the American ambassador himself went in October, leaving his gleaming white embassy in Havana empty. The economic relationship on which Cuba had relied, for good or ill, for 100 years, had been broken. That way of life was finished. Sugar, the mainstay of Cuba's economy, was no longer being bought by the Americans. Who was going to take their place? The Russians. In February 1960, Mr. Mikoyan, the Soviet vice premier, visited Havana and signed a huge economic agreement. Russia would buy 1 million tons of sugar a year and give Cuba a large loan for 12 years. Nothing could have marked Cuba's political shift away from America more dramatically. The island was already a political issue there, and one that was to dog the new American president in Washington from the day of his inauguration.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
John Kennedy came from a large, rich Boston Irish family. His childhood had been happy, privileged, and secure. The young Kennedy grew up to be a social success as well. That seemed to be the beginning and end of his concern. In 1941, he joined the Navy and later fought in the Pacific War. Kennedy's experiences there, including the sinking of his torpedo boat, his wounding, his survival and slow, painful recovery, matured and steadied him. After the war, in 1946, he went into politics in his home state of Massachusetts and was elected to Congress the following year. It was now that Kennedy began to develop the campaigning style that was to help him to the presidency. With the weight of the Kennedy family's ambition and money behind him, and his own charm and intelligence, he could hardly fail. In 1952, he was elected to the Senate. In 1953, he married Jacqueline Bouvier, a woman as beautiful as Kennedy was handsome. The Kennedy success story continued with his winning the fight in 1960 to be the Democratic Party's presidential candidate.
Your nominee and the next president of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
The battle for the presidency was tough and close, but in January 1961, Kennedy became the 35th American president.
Every nation knows, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The triumph of elections soon faded as real problems crowded in on him. At their head, Cuba. America was divided. Some supported the anti-Castro groups, others backed the revolution. In April 1961, at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, 1,400 Cuban exiles, secretly prepared and supported by the Americans, landed to overthrow Castro's government. The invasion lasted just 3 days and was a total failure. Yet Kennedy defiantly took responsibility for it, even tried to justify it.
I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way. But let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible.
But not only in Cuba was the Bay of Pigs seen as a disastrous start for the new young president. He just had his first test of taking a difficult decision and got it totally wrong. The lesson was noted around the world. It was still remembered in Vienna less than 2 months later when President Kennedy and the Soviet leader Prime Minister Khrushchev met for their first talks. The meeting gave them a chance to weigh each other up. The two leaders did most of the talking. Khrushchev made no concessions. Kennedy felt he'd made no impression. Some believe that at Vienna, Khrushchev, then at the height of his power and prestige, decided that Kennedy was a young man who could be pushed around, especially by him. Nikita Khrushchev had risen to supreme power from poverty. His family lived in the Donetsk basin in the Ukraine, where his father worked in the coal mines. Conditions were immensely hard. Khrushchev went into this factory at 15 as an apprentice engineer. He became politically active and took part in strikes, losing his job. During the 1917 October Revolution, he organized workers' militia known as the Red Guards. In 1918, he joined the Communist Party, becoming a junior commissar in the army. By 1925, he was a district party secretary. In 1934, he was elected to the Soviet Central Committee. As leader of the Moscow City Party, he was responsible for the construction of Stalin's prestige Moscow Underground. Its successful completion confirmed Khrushchev's ability to organize and drive others, as well as Stalin's regard for him. But his big test came at Stalingrad during the Second World War. With defeat imminent, Khrushchev was politically responsible for the besieged city, maintaining supplies, keeping the factories going, and helping to organize its successful defense. At Stalin's 70th birthday celebrations, Khrushchev was already in the highest ranks of Soviet power. He was now well placed to take part in the struggle to succeed Stalin. In fact, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev was just one of the group that took power. But he managed to outmaneuver most of his rivals and visited China's Mao Zedong as one of Russia's two leaders. On his world tours, he adopted a showy, popular style, catching the headlines. Though he was part of a two-man team, he was the one people watched. At home, his style was also different. Stalin had never visited the people or courted popularity. But Khrushchev wanted popular support, and this demanded a new approach. In 1956, he made his boldest move yet. He attacked Stalin's rule and revealed some of the crimes committed during those years. At the same time, he preached peaceful coexistence with the West. He set out to challenge American world domination. In 1957, the launching of the first space satellite, the Sputnik, put the Soviet Union dramatically ahead in the race with the United States to conquer space. In September '59, he became the first Soviet leader ever to visit America.
On behalf of the government and of the people of America, I express the hope that you and they will find your stay among us interesting and useful.
It was designed to convince Americans that the Soviet Union wished to live in peace with the United States. It was all very friendly. But the Americans continued to send their U-2 planes on secret photographic missions over the Soviet Union. In 1960, the Russians shot one down and put its pilot on trial. The effects were disastrous. In Paris, Khrushchev, angered at what he regarded as American treachery, walked out of the carefully prepared summit conference of world leaders. At a stormy news conference, he denounced the Americans and their allies. World tensions seemed dangerously high. Things were no better at the United Nations 3 months later.
The United Kingdom will gladly allow any form of inspection and control that is accepted by the Soviet Union. A large number... Well, I'd like it translated if you would.
So this was the 65-year-old man who in June 1961 met the 44-year-old American president in Vienna. Kennedy didn't underrate him. On his return to the United States, he immediately ordered an expansion of America's armed forces at home and abroad. Between 1961 and 62, Kennedy increased the defense budget 3 times. The next crisis was in Berlin. To stop their people fleeing to the west, the East Germans built a wall in August 1961, dividing the city. They did this with Russian support. Kennedy accused the Soviet Union of playing a dangerous game.
The world is not deceived by the communist attempt to label Berlin as a hotbed of war. There is peace in Berlin today. The source of world trouble and tension is Moscow, not Berlin. And if war begins, it will have begun in Moscow and not Berlin.
But the threat to peace was to come even closer. Cuba's Fidel Castro relied on Khrushchev more and more for military and economic aid. The question was, what kind of weapons were the Russians supplying? In August 1962, an American U-2 was sent over Cuba. Its cameras revealed that Soviet rockets and nuclear bombers had been installed on the island. There were 2 kinds of rockets, medium range and intermediate range. If they were fired, they could reach places in North America as far apart as Los Angeles in the west and Washington in the east. Winnipeg, Chicago, New York were all within range. And in South America, Brazil. What should Kennedy do? For nearly a week, he consulted his advisors. There was total agreement that the missile sites should not be tolerated. They were a threat to American security. The problem was how to deal with them. Some believed they should be attacked and bombed. Others suggested blockading Cuba to prevent more Russian supplies reaching the island. Kennedy finally decided that this was the best course. The American Navy was to blockade or quarantine Cuba, and the Russians told to remove their missiles and bombers.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
The American representative confronted the Russians at the United Nations.
Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Я не нахожусь в американском суде, и поэтому не хочу отвечать на вопрос, который задается в прокурорском плане.
Put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
You're in a court of world opinion right now, and you can answer yes or no. You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly.
Продолжайте вашу речь, господин Стивенсон.
Sir, would you please continue your statement? You will have your answer in due course.
Stevenson, would you continue your statement, please? You will receive the answer in the due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
While the public debate went on, the American and Russian leaders kept in contact. Khrushchev, in a letter received the next day, accused Kennedy of threatening him and the Soviet Union with the blockade, and he was not going to observe it. The United States, he said, was pushing mankind to the abyss of a worldwide nuclear war. In fact, the Russian ships bringing more rockets to Cuba soon began to slow down, indicating they were not going to challenge the American blockade. But Kennedy still had to get rid of the missiles and told the Russians this. Khrushchev thereupon sent two messages, one reasonable, the other uncompromising. The first said that if Kennedy would promise that America would not attack Cuba and would lift the blockade, then the question of removal or destruction of the missile sites would be an entirely different one. Kennedy agreed to the terms of the first letter, and on the 28th of October, the Russians ordered their ships to return, taking the rockets with them. The Cuban missile sites were dismantled, and the world pulled back from the brink of a nuclear war. Now the way seemed open for a new approach.
We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interests to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.